Hello, everyone. Let's see. Well, welcome everyone uh, to this exciting book launch event for a book we've been working on for several years called The Measure of Economies, Measuring Productivity in an Age of Technological Change. Hope the sound is okay, and I will proceed then. You know, yep. So let me just give some background on why we put this book together. Uh, Productivity growth, which is a key determinant of economic growth, future prosperity, informs a lot of policy debates. When you see it slow, people worry, what can we do? What are we doing wrong? Productivity slowed considerably in the mid-2000s in the US and in a lot of other advanced economies. And it surprisingly didn't recover. So after averaging about 3.1% per year in 95 to 2000, the business sector labor productivity numbers published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics fell to 2% in 2006 to 2011, and then just 1.2% in 2011 to 19. So it actually seemed to be going from bad to worse. Lately, we have maybe some signs of life in the post-COVID environment, but into COVID, we hadn't really seen anything to give us optimism. But at the same time, we have this digital transformation that was bringing all kinds of new goods, free goods, all kinds of new product capabilities. We like to talk about all the things you can do with your smartphone, which launched in the very beginning of this productivity slowdown. And all these things led to people to conclude actually economic well-being seems to have accelerated, not slowed down. So there seemed to be a disconnect between the rapidly changing economy and how bad the productivity numbers looked. So this led to quite a bit of debate about the role of mismeasurement in the productivity slowdown, and a lot of debate about whether our GDP numbers, GDP growth numbers, and our price indexes are overlooking some significant sources of the growth of either output or welfare, depending on who was participating in the debate and what the argument was. From all this new things brought to us by the digital economy and other things we've seen over the years from technological progress. But unfortunately, the debate was often either argued with a limited understanding of the real underlying measurement concepts and practices, what's being done, what are we trying to do, or it was very well informed, but it was couched in terms that were really only accessible to the experts in the field. So what we've tried to do with this book is kind of solve both deficiencies at the same time. So we're trying to provide a very accessible and intuitive, yet rigorous exploration of the state of knowledge in the field of economic measurement, along with some practical recommendations for measurement improvements. So to try to accomplish this end, we have 11 distinguished experts who have contributed 8 chapters to this book. And the chapters give the background needed to really understand the issues at a fairly deep level. They explain the measurement challenges and issues. They assess the potential scale of the mismeasurement or the potential for measurement problems. And then they recommend some practical improvements that the statistical agencies could do to improve our insight into what's happening and maybe the accuracy of the measures. So the book's analysis, just to give you a simple bottom line, the analysis will suggest that there are measurement issues that could cause productivity growth to be underestimated. That part of the intuition is correct, but there's not a lot of strong evidence that an increase in mismeasurement was responsible for the productivity slowdown. The authors most of the authors see a relatively small role for an increased mismeasurement. So most of the productivity slowdown has to come from other things besides mismeasurement. So that's a little bit of an overview. So let me take a look more at what's in the book. So the book has a chapter that begins, wait a minute, I think we skipped a slide. Let's go back. Yes. Chapter 1 starts out with an introductory chapter that explains the relationship between GDP and a measure of economic welfare. And this chapter provides the background on GDP that one would need to really understand the measurement issues. So looks at what GDP is trying to do and how it relates to some of the problems that are brought up in the measurement debate. It's I would say, couched in very clear language, so it's very helpful, I think, for anybody who wants to understand GDP and the basics of the measurement issues. Then there are two chapters that spend a fair amount of time on price index measurement challenges and practices. So one of those chapters does a stock taking of how good our progress has been since the 1995 to 96 Boskin Commission. So just as background, the Boskin Commission was set up by the Senate Finance Committee to investigate sources of upward bias in the consumer price index, and they wrote a very influential report which had a big impact around the world and in the US. So it's entirely appropriate to have a stock taking of what's been progress since then. Then there's other chapter that looks at price index compilation issues as part of an analysis of the issues raised by new goods, new varieties, and quality changes, which are core of some of the mismeasurement debate. Then we have a chapter that tells us what is intangible investment, why it's critical for growth, documents that it's growing fast, and identifies some broader measures of intangibles that would be good to bring into our numbers to try to understand economic growth better. We also have a chapter on the digital economy. We started out by mentioning the digital economy as a core part of the whole mismeasurement debate. So takes a close look at what it is and what kind of measurement issues it raises and what kind of how bad the problems might be that are caused by some of these issues. Then we have a chapter on healthcare technology. It discusses outcome-based indexes as a way of capturing some of the advances in healthcare technology that conventional methods are missing. And it discusses how to integrate these indexes into the framework of GDP. We have a chapter on an environmentally adjusted productivity index, where I say it adjusts for environmental damage. Now, you might think, oh, that's going to make GDP smaller. And it's true, it reduces the level, but it doesn't necessarily reduce the growth rate. And in fact, it substantially changes the growth picture after the Clean Air Act came into effect. So we'll hear more about that later on. We have a chapter on the challenges and opportunities in using new kinds of data. I call them non-survey data, administrative data, big data, in compilation of official statistics, and has also a vision for how to make the U.S. statistical system function with more efficiency and maybe more timeliness and perhaps even more accuracy by reorganizing and increasing collaboration among the compilers. So let me now pass over to the first four chapters. We have the authors from the other four chapters to present their own work. So let me go briefly through the first four. Chapter 1, GDP and economic well-being. We have it's a very readable explanation of what is GDP, what is it trying to accomplish, what are the aspects of economic well-being that it captures in practice or maybe even in theory, and what does it miss? How does it relate to well-being? So one of the first points in the chapter is, GDP, the objective is to measure domestic production. So the amount of goods and services produced within the domestic economy. And that's just one sort of ingredient into economic welfare. It's not intended to measure welfare. However, the chapter also points out there's considerable correlation or closeness in behavior of GDP growth and the growth of an indicator that you could call a measure of welfare related to consumption of market goods and services. So it actually looks a little more in detail at which aspects of economic well-being are missed. Why is it not a measure of economic well-being? So it looks at things like amount of money you spend on commuting and generating income that counts as personal consumption that really shouldn't be considered as measuring your economic well-being and other factors, but it highlights a particular aspect of economic well-being that could actually be big enough to change the picture, and that's non-market home production. In other words, all the things could involve child care, care of the elderly, or all the things it takes to run a home. There's a lot of home production that's not meant to be sold to other people. And that's actually has changed over time, and it's a pretty big use of time, so it matters. Other themes in the chapter, we have free goods. Remember I mentioned that all these free goods that have appeared through the internet, free search, free entertainment, all the things you can do with your iPhone once you've already paid for the phone. How much are the welfare gains really missed, or should they be in there? And then profit shifting by multinational enterprises. It's another big issue that a lot of these big companies have operations all over the world, and they prefer to report that the profitable activities took place in countries with very low tax rates and favorable tax treatment rather than in the US. So then how much of US GDP is missed by that kind of behavior? Gives a nice theory on cost of living indexes. The Fisher index of real consumption is defined in the chapter. I won't define it here, but it explains why it really is a measure of the growth of the economic welfare from consumption of market goods and services. And then it notes that real GDP tends to track this measure of growth of economic welfare from consumption that includes spending on behalf of households. That means government spending to benefit households. Pretty closely. So there I want to just stop and pause and say, reading the chapter, it's a kind of implicit endorsement of the system of national accounts concept of actual individual consumption, which is a more fine-tuned way of bringing in the spending on behalf of households. You can find it on the OECD website. And if you're trying to do international comparisons or income distribution, consumption distribution analysis, you definitely want to focus on it. Chapter 2, we have measurement of the output, prices, and productivity. What's changed since the Boskin Commission? Again, I mentioned this was a watershed moment in the measurement world when the Boskin Commission came out with its report. And of course, the Boskin Commission was supposed to focus on the bias in the consumer price index. And I suppose by implication, other price indexes that use similar methods would also be implicated, at least in some of their findings. So the chapter looks at price index compilation methods in some detail, and because they play a critical role in measuring output growth and productivity growth. The way we calculate real output growth is we deflate by a price index, and if the deflator is going up too fast, the output index will go up too slowly. And productivity growth is defined based on the growth of output minus the growth of input. So if output growth is underestimated, productivity growth is underestimated. So there's a direct line from upward bias in our price indexes to downward bias in output growth and productivity growth measures. The chapter spends a lot of time on how the indexes, price indexes, output indexes, and productivity indexes are put together. And it documents, does a very nice job of documenting numerous measurement improvements that have been made by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Bureau of Economic Analysis since the time of the Boskin Commission. And also mentions, the economy itself changes and creates some new challenges. So it doesn't mean it's all, not everything that happens causes measurement improvement. The economy can also give us some new challenges just as we're solving the old ones. So the Boskin Commission's report, their central estimate of the total of all the biases they found in the CPI from things like the way the elementary aggregates were put together, substitution bias, there were outlet substitution bias, new lack of quality adjustment, things of that nature, was 1.1% per year, which is a pretty big number if you think inflation is overstated by that much. So the author, Brent Moulton, who was, as I mentioned, distinguished expert, his estimate of downward bias back in '96 when they wrote their report in non-farm private business output, which is the numerator of the non-farm private business productivity measures, was 1.08% per year. So pretty close to the Boskin Commission's number for the CPI. But he put it at just 0.53% per year in 2021. Of course, these numbers depend on assumptions and he has wide ranges, but you do get a picture of a considerable amount of improvement that has gone on over the years. So we shouldn't assume biases that you uncover a long time ago are still the same today. Then we have a chapter on intangible investment. And as the economy is becoming weightless, I think the Chairman Greenspan once said, intangible investment is becoming more and more important compared to tangible physical capital, equipment and structures. So intangible investment plays a big role in long-run productivity growth because things like a new idea, a new insight, that can diffuse and be copied and spread. And plus, you don't have decreasing returns to scale the new ideas the way you might have to physical capital stock like equipment and structures. So it's really a critical part of the productivity story. And so the chapter tells you what are the types of intangible assets we should be worried about, documents their rising importance. So if you look at the figure 3.2 in the lower panel, you could see the orange line, the bottom piece is tangible investment as a percent of private GDP, and you can see it goes down from say 12 to 7 or 8. Then we have intangible investments that are already measured in the national accounts. That's the gray area, and it's getting bigger. Gets up to a little over 5%, I guess, by the end. So as a reminder of what's in there is software is in there, databases, mineral exploration, research and development, and entertainment and artistic originals. So intellectual properties of some certain sort categories. But the part that the chapter says should be in there and isn't is growing even faster. So if you look at the top blue area, you could see the considerable shift in the composition of the capital stock from tangible to intangible. And this has implications for how we understand productivity growth. If we got intangible capital deepening measured correctly, deepening means the extent to which intangible capital is participating in the production process. We would see, first of all, as productivity was falling, intangible capital's contributions was rising, and there's not that much total factor productivity left over in the last period after you adjust for the contribution from intangible capital. So you can get a lot of insights. And the chapter, the author points out that she provided definitions, values, deflators, and service lives, all the ingredients BEA might need to bring more intangibles into GDP. So the last chapter I want to review is productivity measurement, new goods, variety, and quality change. I think it's a fantastic review of this big field of the major controversies in price measurement. So, technological progress and innovation often take the form of appearance of new goods or improved characteristics of an existing good, so a new variety. But capturing these kind of improvements with new goods for new varieties and quality changes in our price indexes is a hard task. So this chapter gives us a comprehensive review of the concepts, techniques, and statistical agency practices involved in measuring these effects. And then it sort of takes a broader look, a very thought-provoking, more philosophical, broader look at the questions. Talks about some radical approaches like asking people how much you'd have to get paid to be willing to give up Facebook. And a little bit on the limits of what we can really measure in terms of benefits of radical new goods like the invention of the internet or the invention of the smartphone. So then statistical agencies practices are reviewed. There's a particular one, the matched models method, which is for handling product entry and exit, which basically splices together samples, price changes calculated with samples containing continuing items to basically bridge the gap when stuff exits and enters. And then it does a very good review of what's in quality adjustment techniques that are used by researchers and statistical agencies, including hedonic regression, options pricing, which is where they just figure out what's the impact of this added option on the price of the computer or the car or whatever, producer's cost of producing the improved quality. And then there's a very interesting discussion of approaches based on unit values, which effectively just says, for example, you might measure communications based on the number of bytes of data transmitted. So average cost per byte then becomes your price index. That's a unit value. And reservation price theory with maximum price at which someone would purchase the new good is also discussed. So you get a theoretical, conceptual, practical review of the whole field. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to Louise. I appreciate everyone's attention. Louise, I can't, you're muted still.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, Marshall. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the chapter on measuring productivity in the healthcare sector that I co-wrote with David Cutler. So if we look at the statistics, the official statistics for labor productivity and prices in the healthcare sector, you can see on the bottom left, that's labor productivity growth. The dark blue is non-farm business, so the economy as a whole. The light blue is hospitals and nursing homes, and the gray is ambulatory physicians, outpatient. And you can see that on average, not every single period, but on average, the measured productivity in the healthcare is much lower than the productivity in the rest of the economy. Similarly, as Marshall was describing, the opposite of that is that when you have lower productivity growth, you typically have higher price growth. So on the right-hand side is healthcare inflation and overall GDP price inflation, and the healthcare inflation is in orange and GDP price inflation is in taupe. And you can see that over the 1987 to 2019 period, that's the bar on the left, and over almost all the subperiods, healthcare price inflation tends to be faster. So we're always talking about how healthcare costs are growing so much. That's what shows up in the official data. This is what is used to create GDP because the healthcare sector is a large part of GDP, about 18%. And so this is a super important topic. Okay, so is that right? Or is it mismeasurement? So some people think it's right. They say, look, they attribute it to something called Baumol's cost disease. So the idea is the health sector is very labor intensive. You need a nurse to take care of patients. You need a doctor. And labor intensive sectors tend to have low productivity growth because a lot of times you get productivity growth from new capital or automation. And because we have low productivity growth in the healthcare sector, the argument goes, but you still have to pay rising wages because of rising productivity elsewhere, the healthcare sector, which isn't still has to hire lots and lots of people, but pays more and more for those people, has high price growth. The classic example of Bummel's cost disease is a string quartet where you cannot be any more efficient playing a live concert now than you could 200 years ago for classical music. And so there's been no increase in productivity, but salaries, of course, have increased because salaries overall in the economy have increased, and therefore prices of concerts have increased. So this is an argument you hear a lot. I reject it. Healthcare is really different from a string quartet. If you go and look at what we've seen that we got from the healthcare sector, and we document this in the chapter, just massive improvements to outcomes over time in cancer mortality, in heart disease, in infant mortality, in so many domains. So the healthcare sector is clearly something that changes quite a bit over time. And one of the big problems is that the improvements in outcomes that I'm talking about are really not captured by the official statistics. So why is that? So in the official statistics, they get a price deflator. They'd say, okay, how much was a hip replacement at this hospital by this insurer, this month, and how much did it cost last month, and what's the difference? So they can control the thing that you're measuring. It's that same hip replacement hospital insurer, maybe doctor. If there's a big costly change in a procedure, then they're supposed to capture it. If all of a sudden you're using a different kind of implement or a different something different that costs a lot, they're supposed to account for it by subtracting the cost of improvement. It's not clear how much that actually happens in practice. And a lot of times improvements in healthcare are not big things. They're very incremental, different suture, a different, slightly different way of doing an operation. And those things are surely not captured. And there's no explicit attempt to account for outcomes. So to the extent they try to account for changes at all, it's all on the cost side. So as I said, healthcare is already 18% of GDP and rising. So mismeasurement is really important, not just for affecting our view of the healthcare sector, but also overall GDP and productivity growth. So the chapter goes into how should you better measure health prices. So the kind of fundamental insight is that people are not trying to buy a hip replacement. They're trying to buy less pain and ability to walk. So they're trying to buy improved health and not a procedure per se. The literature has come up with two basic adjustments that we discuss. One is you should account for substitution between settings by measuring health spending by disease. I'll talk about that in the next slide. And two, you should explicitly account for changes in outcomes. Okay, so let's talk about the substitution between settings and interventions. So one of the things that people have noticed is that a lot of healthcare has been moved from inpatient to outpatient. When healthcare moves from inpatient to outpatient, BLS will consider that two completely separate items, right? They're going to say, well, what's happened to this inpatient cost of surgery? And then what's happened to this outpatient cost? But there's no accounting for the fact, well, if it's outpatient, it's a lot cheaper. They will not count that as a price decline. Similarly, you can think about talk therapy and drug-related treatment for mental health. And the BLS will treat those as separate items. So if you have a new drug that successfully treats some patients with drugs instead of cost or talk therapy, we'll never capture that savings as lower prices. So one exception to this that they have done is the switch from brand name to generic drugs, which before this switch, they would be considered different drugs, but now BLS considers them to be perfect substitutes. And so if there's a switch where people were getting a brand name drug and now they're getting the same drug at a much lower price that it's generic, they will count those cost savings. But that's kind of the one exception. So one solution to this dilemma is to say, I'm not measuring hip replacements, outpatient hip replacement, inpatient hip replacement, talk therapy. I'm measuring treatment. So let's look at spending by disease. And so the BLS publishes in their health satellite accounts estimates of spending by disease, which is not an easy thing to do. Okay, so once you do spending by disease, you're obviously getting spending that's increasing because of greater intensity of use, because more people have diseases. You need to then think very carefully about what are we buying for our spending by disease. You need to account for outcomes. Okay, so there are three methods in the literature. So the literature was just going along and different people did it differently without kind of realizing it. And the three methods are the one that BLS kind of follows, which is subtract the cost of any improvement in treatment, right? So if I'm saying, oh, we are doing a new treatment and it costs $500 more, subtract that extra $500 off the price. Don't count the increased cost as a price increase. Instead, recognize you're getting something for it. That prevents cost increases from showing up as higher prices, but it doesn't capture any surplus from that increased cost. So if a $500 innovation is really, really valuable, it would never capture that. Two, Marshall ended his talk talking about unit value. So people have tried to do the unit value. What has happened to the price of an additional year of life over time? Since we want to buy years of life, you might say, well, I want to know what's happened to the price of that. It sounds intuitively right, but actually we don't think it is. It won't fully capture the benefits of that extra health spending. Why is that? It's because in many things, when you look at a declining price, you can buy as many units of it as you want. So if I could buy as many units of additional life at the prevailing price as I want, that would be a useful metric, the unit value per year of price. But you can't, right? I might in year one I can buy an additional year of life for 15,000, but I can't buy 2 years of life. I can only get a procedure that prolongs my life for 1 year, and then the next year there's a new procedure that can keep me alive for 2 years, and the whole price is 50,000, right? The price per year of life has increased from 15,000 for 1 year to 25,000 per year for 2 years for 50,000. But I may be much, much better off because I may value a year of life at 100,000, right? And so that brings us to method 3, which is what you should really do is subtract the value of the treatment improvements from the price. So if a year of life in good health is worth 150,000, an improvement that increases cost 50,000 but provides an additional 6 months of life, which is worth 75,000, actually lowers the price of treatment by 15,000. This should be 25. All right. So that all sounds great. There are a lot of challenges to actually implementing it, which we discussed in the chapter. The first one is how to put a value on health outcomes, not just a year of life, so you could put a value per year of life, but also improvements in the quality of life, because not all of healthcare is aimed at increasing the number of lives, but increasing the quality of life. How do you link improvements in outcomes to changes in treatment, right? So we want to say, oh, we have improved outcomes, but some of that might be not because of healthcare spending. It might be because people are taking better treatment, better care of themselves, because there's less pollution, because things are worse, because there's a pandemic. So you really want to be able to causally link spending to outcomes. We talk about how to fit this into a NIPA framework. How much of health spending is consumption? How much is investment? And how much is an intermediate good where you value the healthcare because it allows you to get to work, for example? And if that's what it is, we're already capturing the value of your work in the NIPAs. And then data problems, which is that there are big claims databases, but they don't have all the information that you want. So let me quickly say what the findings are thus far. There's a table that goes through the literature and summarizes the findings using all 3 methods. I'm just going to talk about the findings now using that cost of living approach, that third method that we like best. It shows that depending on the study, healthcare prices, which I showed you, have been increasing much faster than overall GDP prices, that once you adjust for outcomes, they've either increased more slowly than the GDP deflator, or for other studies, perhaps at the same rate. And it depends on the study and the population and the assumption of how much a value of year of life is. So if quality adjusted prices rise 2% less per year than official estimates suggest, real healthcare productivity rises 2% more than official estimates suggest. The implications for MFP or TFP are less obvious because we would want to adjust not just the numerator, what are we getting for improved outcome, but we would also want to adjust the inputs. If MRIs are getting better, for example, then TFP in the health treatment sector may not be improving, but TFP in the medical equipment industry is. So thank you very much. I will now move it on to pass it on to Nick and stop sharing. If I can figure out how to stop sharing.
Okay, My name's Nick Muller, and I'll be talking today about one of the chapters in our volume entitled Productivity and the Environmental Accounts. In the most general sense, the motivation for this work stems from work some 50 years ago done by now two Nobel Prize winners, Bill Nordhaus and James Tobin, who wrote a paper on empirically estimating the aspects of economic output that were not captured in conventional measures like GDP. And since that time, economists of many stripes have recognized the importance of environmental services to ultimately comprehensive measurements of economic output and therefore productivity. Some 25 years later, Nordhaus and Cochlenberg, in a volume written for the National Academies, suggested that among the various aspects of incomplete measurement that they pointed out in the 1970s, it was air pollution damages and greenhouse gases that were likely to contribute the largest amounts overall to the correction to measures of comprehensive output. Subsequent to that work, empirical estimates have confirmed that air pollution damages in particular are large relative to GDP. This is a graph taken from a very recent paper of mine that shows among 4 different income classes, World Bank income classes, we see that air pollution and greenhouse gas damages combined, that's the GED measure I'll talk about in a moment, amount to between 2.5% to 10% of conventionally measured GDP across the different income scales of the countries covered in the analysis. So there's another aspect of the economic and regulatory context that's very important in determining how environmental pollution damages pertain to or relate to both output and productivity. And that's the policy environment, in particular, the environmental and energy policy framework. In the context of the empirical work done in the chapter, we had a period in the US in the early 1970s where several landmark environmental policies were passed. This is the early 70s and late 1960s, and these included things like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Safe Drinking Water Act, among many others. It's been estimated that the costs associated with compliance just with the Clean Air Act, not even the others listed there, associated with implementation and compliance have been quite large. Just between the year 2000 and 2020, the estimates for cost of compliance and implementation have been on the order of $1 trillion. Notice the act was passed in 1970. So along with these activities that are geared towards implementing the act and complying with the act are, of course, associated reallocations of productive inputs like labor and capital. And it has been argued in the literature that at least some portion of the observed productivity slowdown in the US economy following 1970 was associated with this reallocation of trillions of dollars of economic resources towards compliance with environmental rules. It's also important to note from the perspective of productivity measurement that the benefits associated with, say, cleaner air and water largely accrue outside of the market boundary. And in particular here, I'm thinking about premature mortality risk. That is, the fact that by lowering our exposures to environmental pollutants, what we're doing, among other things, is mitigating the effect that those pollutants have on the likelihood of exposed persons dying in a given period. So the upshot of this consideration is that our standard measures of productivity, which rely on output measures like GDP, are likely to capture the costs associated with these policies by virtue of the fact that we have attenuated GDP output and growth by virtue of complying with environmental rules and policies, but these measures are not likely to capture the bulk of the benefits. And that gives us some important things to think about with respect to how we measure both output and productivity in light of or in the context of big policy changes. So this graph is taken from my chapter, And it is showing a fairly long time series from the late 1950s to 2016 of two measures of ambient air pollution. The top dark line is TSP, or total suspended particulates. The bottom line is a subset of that called PM2.5, or fine particulate matter. The vertical lines are NBER recessions. So there's a couple things to say. One, just generally, is notice the downward trend in these pollutant measures. So the U.S. economy, according to these measures of air quality, has been cleaning up. And two, notice that cleaning up happens in a very pro-cyclical way. That is, when the economy enters the recession, damages and air pollution impacts fall. And that's a theme that the chapter discusses at some length. In contrast to the regulated pollutants like we just saw, PM2.5 and total suspended particulates, I'm showing you here emissions of greenhouse gases in the US, which over the time period studied in this chapter were largely not directly regulated. So, not surprisingly, emissions of these pollutants, which tend to be produced when we burn fossil fuels, were rising over this period of time. But again, notice the importance of the business cycle, the energy crisis, the recessions in the early 1980s, and the Great Recession all feature significant step downs in these emissions while still trending upwards until the recent era. So one final point before I show you some of the results in the chapter is to note that if we are to build in measures of pollution impact directly into measures of output and ultimately productivity, we have to monetize. We have to convert physical units like tons or parts per million into dollars so that we're measuring things in the same units, and then we build into our productivity measures. So from the point of view of air pollution, damage is comprised primarily of adverse effects on human health. And as I said, this is primarily about premature mortality risk. That means that the results in this chapter and in the literature that explores the impacts of air pollution on the US economy, damages are sensitive to how we monetize mortality risk, and that's reliant on a parameter known as the value of a statistical life. Importantly, that's not the measure of a life per se, it's the measure of the marginal rate of substitution between income and mortality risk. And it's the standard way that the literature and practitioners use to measure the value in monetary terms of these changes in mortality risk. For greenhouse gases, we use what's called the social cost of carbon, a dollar per ton measure of the present value of expected damages of a current emission, again, a dollar per ton basis, and we multiply that times reported emissions, so a price times quantity approach. We use the federal government's, the US federal government's SCC in this chapter. And then finally, we combine these two monetary metrics of social cost and deduct them from GDP to estimate, as Marshall mentioned, environmentally adjusted productivity, or EAP. This table, taken from the chapter, shows you annual growth estimates for three metrics: regular GDP, GED, which is the air pollution and greenhouse gas damages, and EAP, which is the augmented measure of productivity. Over the entire sample, GDP is growing at 1.7%. That's common knowledge. Air pollution and GHG damages are falling at about 1% per year, and that implies that our EAP measure is actually growing more rapidly as the US economy was cleaning up. Now, what's particularly interesting about this time period is before the passage of our landmark environmental policies, you'll see that damages were increasing quite rapidly. And the fact that that rate of increase in damage exceeded GDP growth means that when we compute the EAP measure, productivity is actually less rapidly growing than we had thought, because there's an increasing burden of mortality risk and damage on the economy that is not captured in GDP. And then finally, in our post-regulatory period, you can see the orientation between these metrics changes, such that when damages are falling, The augmented measure of productivity, or EAP, is growing more rapidly than GDP because the economy is cleaning up. So this graph, also taken from the chapter, is just summarizing what we saw on the table. You can see the vertical line is showing you when the Clean Air Act in particular was passed. And prior to that period, GDP-based productivity measures were growing more rapidly than EAP. And after that period, EAP growth exceeds GDP. And the reason is shown in the right-hand panel of the graph. Damages over that period were falling. Okay, so just to wrap up, including, as Nordhaus and Cocklenberg noted, including air pollution and greenhouse gas damages into standard measures of output appreciably affects our productivity estimates. Importantly, policy realigned the difference between GDP-based productivity and EAP measures. That is, it just changed the trajectory of damages in the economy from an economy that was growing more dirty to one that was cleaning up. I emphasize the importance of the business cycle in this context. Damages are strongly pro-cyclical. That's been found in other work. And importantly, when we look back to the 1950s, damages in the US were really driven by air pollution, and therefore EAP was as well. But I suspect that when we look forward, future impacts are likely to be driven by greenhouse gases as air pollution and water pollution emissions continue to fall. So with that, I'll next turn it over to our next speaker. Let me stop share. Thank you all very much.
Okay, hi folks. Stephanie, I think I do need you to share your screen.
Yep, no problem.
Thanks. So while Stephanie is doing that, I'll note that as a staff economist at the Federal Reserve Board, I need to say that these are not the views of the Federal Reserve, the Board of Governors. There should be nothing in here that you should interpret as a statement about the economic outlook. Okay, so next slide, thanks. Okay.
Not letting me click forward for some reason. There we go.
Okay. So motivation for this chapter, digitalization is at the top of mind for many observers of the economy, including policymakers. Since the mid-20th century, information technology innovation has driven down the cost of gathering, storing, transforming, and transmitting information. Firms and households have responded to that by using more IT, and the economy has become more digitalized. So that phenomenon, as Marshall mentioned at the outset, is central to our understanding of the role of innovation in productivity and in economic growth in the post-war era. There are a lot of outstanding questions that we're wrestling with right now, including whether recent developments are simply a continuation of this long-standing trend, or we may be witnessing another IT boom through free goods and artificial intelligence and the like. To answer that question and others like it, there are an array of measurement challenges that make it difficult that we have to wrestle with to bring statistics to bear on such questions. And that's the topic of my chapter. Next slide. So we should define at the outset what we mean by the digital economy. Informally, the digital economy, when we talk about this in, for example, Harvard Business Review, which is where I made this word cloud from, we see references to a lot of companies that we think of as digital economy companies, a lot of different concepts, but we need to put boundaries around the digital economy. In a sense, everything seems to be digitalized these days for us to be able to isolate the contribution of IT to growth and productivity. Okay, next. So typically growth economists think about this question, others like it in this framework. We think about the contribution of IT, meaning hardware and software, to productivity via more efficient IT production, that is output in the IT producing industries, the industries that produce computers and software and so forth. And then the contribution from the use of IT all over the economy. And you can see on the right that the IT production TFP contribution during the IT boom about doubled, maybe a little bit more. The contribution in gray from capital deepening jumped up as well, and both have moved down since then and contributed to the slowdown that Marshall mentioned. Okay, next slide. So IT, as I said, is present throughout the economy. So one way to think about this is in terms of sectors. If you look on the lower right, we have an IT manufacturing sector. That's the production I mentioned of hardware and software. And then that IT capital is used throughout the economy. On the lower left, other sectors, including healthcare, are using IT capital, and you can see a little MRI machine there. So we should think about all equipment that has a substantial amount of electronics embedded in it as IT capital as well. On the upper left, you can see digital platforms. These are the companies, Google, Facebook, and the like, that we think of as producing all of these free goods that Marshall mentioned, which you can see in the middle, including business content, media that's shared for free, various different kinds of information, and then also user-generated content you can see on the right. And then going back to the concept of measuring welfare produced in the household through household production, there's also a lot of IT in use in the household that's making households more efficient. And in recent years, that seems to have been an important locus for IT innovation. Next. Okay, so what are the practical measurement challenges that we face? Well, three big ones are accounting for quality change. Louise already mentioned that. New IT products often or even typically embody substantial changes or improvements, mostly in quality. We have to pay careful attention to that when measuring inflation. So our concept of output should be quality units rather than just the number of computers, if you like. We also have to be attentive to consistency across products. Some products like smartphones and computers and high volume production products typically have data with sufficient detail to support good measurement, and others, like MRI machines, for example, do not. So this may lead to a spurious difference in output growth between companies that are producing those two things. Consistency across statistical programs is important. So differences in data quality can cause inconsistencies across measurement of different economic flows. Consumption, imports, investment are typically measured in different statistical programs, at least the prices are. Okay, so I'll go on to the next slide and talk about prices. So typically the way that these flows are measured is through calculating the nominal value of those flows and then dividing by a price index. And the price index is where a lot of the action, the measurement action, happens. So what are the kinds of things we do to try to capture quality? This is a picture of match model index construction, where you can see on the left the prices for individual models. And then on the right, you can see two different approaches to measuring the aggregate price change let's see, it's smartphones. So the dashed line on the right is just the average price of a smartphone, ignoring the model level information. The solid line is what we get when we account for the individual price trends of the separate models. So that's a very important thing to account for, and it requires highly granular data. Okay, next slide. Another important consideration for statistical agencies who often do have such granular data is that the frequency with which they refresh the basket of models that they're looking at can make a big difference. So here we're looking at prices for microprocessors, again, individual price trends on the left. And then on the right, you can see the solid line, again, is the average price. The dotted line in the middle is the match model index, like in the last slide, and you can see that's lower than the average price. But that's constructed when the sample is refreshed once a year. On the other hand, if you were to continuously update the sample, or if you like, look at the whole universe of prices throughout the full life cycle for each model, you get a rather different price index, and that's the one on the bottom. So that's an important focus for agencies as well. Okay, next slide. Another approach to accounting for quality change, as you probably may have heard, is hedonic indexes, where you basically put the price for the model on the left and you put the characteristics of that model on the right, and you run a regression, and the part of the price that's not explained by the characteristics is the underlying inflation. So when you look at a microprocessor with more performance and it costs the same as a processor with less performance in the previous year, what you should see is a price decline, even though their nominal prices are the same. So a critical thing to consider here is whether we have the correct characteristics. And what you can see on the right is the implied quality trend from two different kinds of hedonic indexes. In one, we're using the technical features of the microprocessor, so clock speed and cache memory and the like. And in the other, we're using benchmark scores, where the performance of these processors on individual tasks is measured, and that's used as the control variable on the right. And as you can see, you get rather different answers in recent years, but prior to 2005 or so, you got very similar answers. And this is that disconnect you may have heard about between clock speed and performance, the degradation of Moore's law and the like. The industry has had to become much more creative in the ways that they achieve performance, and so it's harder to control for quality this way. Okay, next slide. As I mentioned, we also worry about consistency across product types. I mentioned MRI machines. You can see this is the composition of production in the US electronics sector. And prior to 2007 or so, a larger share of production was general purpose electronics. So you think high volume things like personal computers and so forth. And since that time, general purpose electronics have moved offshore, and special purpose electronics like MRI machines and navigational equipment for aerospace and defense and so forth has become far more important. And then you can see on the right that the price trends, these are growth rates. The price trends for these two different kinds of electronics are quite different. In fact, the price trend for special purpose electronics is basically flat. And while these things come from very different markets, different scales of production and so forth, they each have substantial share of electronics embedded in them. And so you might think that the price declines in semiconductors and other kinds of electronic components would be passing through here and driving prices for special purpose electronics down. And one explanation for that flat price trend is it's just much more difficult to measure quality for these special purpose electronics. So this may be a place where mismeasurement is coming into play. Okay, next slide. And the last thing I'll mention in terms of specific concrete challenges is, as I said earlier, these prices come from different statistical programs. And the price for, say, consumer spending on electronics comes from one program at the BLS. The price for imports comes from another. And the price for production comes from a third. And if you take the ratio of import prices to domestic prices, what you actually see, the solid line here, is that the relative price of imports has been going up as measured in the statistical system. Well, at the same time, the share of imports, as we all know, in consumption of electronics is going up as well. So we look at that and we see a price rising, and yet consumers shifting toward imports. We suspect that there's a measurement problem there. Okay, next slide. So we get into all these different concrete measurement challenges in the chapter. There's others that I didn't mention. And then what we try to do toward the end is take a very rough pass at calculating how much these different measurement problems would contribute to the bias in productivity and see how much the the mismeasurement problem could be causing or contributing to the productivity slowdown. And there are a number of rows here where you can see for data, I say that the adjustment is unknown, likely positive. For free content, unknown, likely positive. There's some big chunks of this that are still highly debated. But the portions that we're able to nail down fairly well, like the bias in IT hardware equipment, the bias in semiconductors, the bias in software, those contribute to the slowdown to some degree, but we're talking about basis points here, not tenths of a percentage point. So down at the bottom, you can see I've tallied up the things that we were willing to take a stand on, and the productivity slowdown would be 13 basis points lower between 1996-2004 and the 2005-2015 period. So a pretty small contribution. And I deliberately stopped here at 2015 because a lot of the things that are in play right now, like artificial intelligence, free content, and so forth, are very much open to debate. Okay, next slide. So just to go back to the theme of the book, the chapter on the digital economy and the volume as a whole identify ongoing measurement challenges and suggest directions for improvement. It's important to emphasize here that these are really hard problems, and that statistical agencies are well aware of them and wrestling with them, but they require a substantial amount of brain power and funding to tackle them all. Okay, I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, David. This is Erica Groshen, and I'm going to be talking, that was a great lead-in from David. I'm going to be talking about some of the challenges, the opportunities of modernizing measurement of productivity with non-standard data. And really, all of the chapters in some ways lead up to this discussion of, okay, there are challenges, and this is really important. What can the statistical agencies be doing to meet these? So what we wanted to, in this chapter with my two co-authors, Mike Horrigan, who was at BLS for a very long time, is now at Upjohn, and Chris Kurtz at the Board of Governors, who studied a lot of productivity issues and also uses of non-survey data. We got together, and the goal of the chapter is to assess the opportunities to improve, modernize the measurement of productivity. And we thank Louise and Marshall for the whole volume and giving us an opportunity to talk about this. So, there we go. Now, why is this not going? There we go. Okay, so you've heard already that measuring productivity is really important. It drives national well-being, and really importantly, evidence-based policy requires understanding productivity growth. Monetary and fiscal policy depend on this, understanding the causes and the consequences of productivity growth depends on having good measures of productivity, and so does understanding distributional impacts. So let's go back to basics for just a minute and say, well, there are two big measures of productivity that we're talking about here. There's labor productivity growth and multi-factor productivity growth. And labor productivity growth is put together from two terms: output growth, the output growth rate, and you subtract from that the labor hours growth rate, and that's how it's calculated. And this is produced by the BLS on a quarterly basis. There's a 2-month lag in putting it out, and it uses, and I've highlighted here, what the agencies contribute to this estimate. You've got output measures from the BEA and census, and this is deflated by price indices, mostly from the BLS. And you also have labor hours, which are produced by the BLS. Multi-factor productivity growth has a different equation. It's the quantity index of output divided by a quantity index of labor and capital input combined, right? This is produced by BLS only on an annual basis. There's a 3-month lag in putting it out, and you see all of the different agencies, again, BES, BEA, BLS, and Census that contribute from different programs to doing this estimate. So I hope this is, and the rest of the discussion that we've had is pretty clear. Measuring productivity may be important, but it's also really hard, right? You've got disparate sourcing, all these different programs contributing to it, and the input data are often incompatible in some way or another. That's a challenge. Another challenge is that it's particularly hard to measure productivity in the service sector, and the service sector is growing rapidly, getting more and more important. And finally, this contributes enough noise that you need averages over time to see the trends. So let's take, much has been done. Productivity measures have gotten a lot better over time, but there's more to do. So when I tell you productivity growth is noisy, here we have US labor productivity growth from 1959 to 2019. Now, mostly you've been seeing these bars that are represented here, but underlying that are these aren't even the quarterly numbers. These are the average annual numbers, right? And you see how they jump around an awful lot, and it's only by aggregating them across time that we can see the trends. And then if you look at the two components, the hours growth rate and the real output growth rate over this period of time, where output is in black and hours is in blue, you see that these don't, sometimes they move together, sometimes they don't. And the productivity is the difference between these two lines. This is part of the reason that people really want to think about whether measurement could be causing some of this noise and whether we can do better. So, much of the productivity, the input to all of these programs right now is based on surveys that the agencies do of companies and sometimes of households. But that, in a more digitized world, is not the only source of information. So there's strong incentives for the statistical agencies to start incorporating more and more non-survey organic records. And we're talking about here government or private administrative data, transaction records, web scraping, private sector aggregations. And why? Because this gives us an opportunity to improve granularity, coverage, timeliness, precision, or accuracy, and also to counteract a sad factor in all of this, which is that survey response rates have been falling for a long time and continue to do so. So by going to when I use the term non-standard, what I'm talking about is basically non-survey data to augment survey data collections. The idea is you can reduce the burden and get more information. You can improve efficiency and resilience, so that there's strong incentives to try and incorporate more and more of these other sources of data. But unfortunately, there's no free lunch. There are some big challenges for statistical agencies in using non-standard data. First of all, it may be lower quality. They may not have good access to it. They need to protect respondents to make sure that they don't reveal confidential information. They need to be able to incorporate this data into operations in a dependable way and have enough computer storage and computational capacity to do it. It has to be timely enough for the operations. the numbers have to be comparable to each other in key ways, or you're just creating more noise by time, by sectors, and there has to be mission compatibility to avoid things like data manipulation of the people contributing this information, front running, curation quality, continuity, pricing, things like that. So there are big challenges. I mention those because they are very real and part of doing this work, not because they can't be managed, but they're very real and part of why it takes a long time and why it's not necessarily less expensive. So with that in mind, the agencies really do want to do this. And one way to start off thinking about it is that if you think about using more and more of this non-standard data, well, the easiest case to think about is when the new sources just replace survey equivalent data. So you used to ask people information, and now you have electronic records that are keeping it in transactions, and you can just swap one into the other. And that is a great case, and it has happened, and it certainly has happened. Particularly in the CPI, in the price measures, right? But otherwise, and this is most often, the new sources require a change in the measurement strategy overall. And so this requires research into whether or not this change is beneficial, and looking deeply into that. Can you create a transparent methodology around it? And also, is there a transparent methodology in the creation of those data that you are adopting? Because a keystone of the statistical system is that in order for data to be trustworthy, people have to understand how it's made. And if so, buying black box products is not does not contribute to transparency, right? Will this require a break in the series? Will it require changes in some other series for consistency? Is the level of aggregation acceptable? So all of these things, again, are manageable, but they contribute to the challenges that the agencies face. That said, let me talk about some of the things that have already been done and are underway and biggest opportunities. And I'm going to go through these really fast. The paper, the chapter goes into them in much, much more detail, but I want to give you a flavor of what's happened already. So let me start. I'm going to start with things that are pretty much done in some sense, and then go on to the more things that are more underway and for which there are not so many products. So here's some examples of things that are already available. David Byrne and Fernald and Marshall, right, use new data sources to investigate causes and measurement issues in productivity, and a really interesting study in 2016. The NBER and the Census Bureau Center for Economic Studies created a database with detailed industry information on labor productivity. Again, using a lot, making use of non-standard data. And there's a disaggregated productivity project that's been around for a while, and this measures the dispersion for official statistics. And this implies that measurement issues are very important and need more work. Some in between available and in progress, we have important work being done by the Board of Governors to leverage the quarterly survey of plant capacity to impute productivity before the census data comes out. There are estimates of utilization adjusted quarterly measures of multi-factor productivity. So multi-factor productivity is typically annual. This is there's an effort, work by Fernald and Basu, looking at creating quarterly MFP. And then Louise talked a lot about various uses of medical records, and there's work being done by BLS, BEA, to look at CMS data, to look at insurance company data, to really begin to understand productivity growth in the medical sector. Right. So two key opportunities going forward. We've mentioned medical records. Oh, I think one of the biggest opportunities out there that we still haven't tapped into is better use of unemployment insurance system wage records, particularly if these are standardized across companies and augmented. This could increase the granularity, the timeliness, accuracy, frequency, and fields of all of this information. We need to understand the labor market better to study productivity better. And there's an initiative being led by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation to push in that direction, which could be quite valuable and feed into all of this. Another source that people have worked on already, and there are many opportunities to really to expand this, is use of credit card data for understanding both prices and quantities. And so this is work being done at BEA and also at the Board of Governors. So where could all of this get us? I have a pretty picture of the panacea moth. What does the productivity panacea look like? Well, it would consist of research finding the best measures of service sector productivity. It would be availability of monthly, even perhaps weekly productivity growth by industry, by state, by local areas with only short lags. So we would know on an ongoing basis what's going on. And ideally, this would be comparable across industries and regions and add up to the national numbers. The input components, the ones I've showed you, these components that go into the productivity measures would be reported as disaggregated as the published statistics against, so that research and policy could really identify causes and consequences more clearly. And we'd also be in this world, in this panacea that we could work to, we could have much less dramatic revisions to productivity numbers than we have now. Now, the road to this panacea is going to depend on three important things. First of all, robust access to high quality surveys, because those won't go away, but also to high quality non-standard sources. So incorporating the information from all of these possibilities. Then the agencies need adequate resources and mechanisms to support coordinating amongst themselves and doing research and building in the agility in the three key agencies, BLS, BLA, and Census. This is a challenge. And this, of course, has to be done in a way that is independent of political interference, or no one will trust the data. So I hope that you have the sense that there really is a lot of progress being made, yet there's much more to do. All of this, though, can't happen without support. So I want to close by thanking the organizers and then turn this over to Louise. So thank you very much. And that's our contact information.
Thank you so much, Erica. I'm going to wait for these slides to be gone.
Okay. Okay.
There we go. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope that these presentations was a whirlwind tour from our book. Give you a flavor of what's in the book. And as Erica said, much has been done in improving productivity measurement, but there's more to do. So as part of this effort, we asked all of our authors to end each chapter with a list of recommendations for the statistical agencies, which they did. I'm not going to have time to go through all the recommendations now. Some of them are quite general: more use of hedonics, more use of big data, more harmonization of data across time and across countries, which was very important for thinking about imports and exports and getting those prices right, very important for the digital economy. Others are basically requests for the agencies to operationalize the types of research that were described in each chapter. For example, how should they start pursuing environmental adjustments? Broader capitalization of intangibles. How should they go about doing that? What kind of data should they be gathering? How should they pursue outcomes-based healthcare deflators? There are also some specific recommendations that are sort of perhaps easier. So Byrne talks about the importance of regular re-estimating depreciation rates. In our chapter on healthcare, we recognize that going full into outcomes-based deflators is a very large undertaking. It will take a really long time. And we have some recommendations on how to improve healthcare spending deflators at the treatment of healthcare provision in the NIPIS as they are currently constituted. And so we hope you'll look at the book and look at all the recommendations. I want to end today with something which Erica also mentioned, which is we are in a very tight budget. It's going to be very tight non-discretionary spending, which is what funds the statistical agencies, and they've had to rein in their budgets quite a bit in recent years as well. And so it might be tempting to think, oh, we don't need to spend so much on the statistical agencies. But one of the things that Brett Moulton mentions in his chapter is like the cost of improved statistics is so modest compared to the value that you get, the cost of policies that are conducted with deficient statistics. Carol Corrado quotes Ben Bernanke. Ben Bernanke will be more likely to promote innovative activity if we're able to measure it more effectively and document its role in economic growth. And for those who say, well, big data can do it all, I think Erica just pointed out that big data is really valuable and we need to harness it more. But everybody agrees that you need those government statistics to know how to calibrate those big data, to know whether or not they're represented, to know whether or not they're giving us what you want. So we think it's really important for economists to keep making the case about the importance of this work. It sounds sort of very technical, as you saw, but it is really important. And we hope that this book contributes to that discussion and serves as a stepping stone for those who are interested in learning more about measurement. I want to thank all of the authors of this book for there's a lot of work put into it. I think the book really is going to be a very valuable resource. I want to thank my co-editor, Marshall, who I have learned a great deal from in helping to edit this book. And so I will end that with just a thank you to all of you for really what I hope will be a much appreciated book. I think it's really a wonderful volume. Thank you.
All right, we are clear.